everyone, and welcome to another LGBT plus History Month event from Northern Pride. I'm Namerta, the Family and Youth Officer, and today we've got a special education discussion panel themed specifically around Section 28 and the history of that for our community. And I believe Steve's got a video to bring in about this.
Who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
In 1987, Margaret Thatcher spoke the words that would soon lead to the implementation of a damaging piece of homophobic legislation known as Section 28. The amendment stated that council should not intentionally promote homosexuality or promote the teaching in any maintained school of the acceptability of homosexuality as a pretended family relationship. This meant that LGBT groups and clubs were forced to disband, and LGBT-themed literature was off the shelves in schools and libraries. The community was made to feel like they were second-class citizens and felt pressured to censor themselves. Theresa May spoke out in support of Thatcher's policy, writing that most parents want the comfort of knowing Section 28 is there. It has only been 30 years since Section 28 was put into place, but the profound effects it had on the community lasted and will continue to last for generations.
So, yes, Section 28, a historical piece of legislation that was brought in the 1980s under Margaret Thatcher's government. You saw the footage there of Thatcher's speech. It really was a piece of law that that was in place to target education in particular. I think that there's lots of debates around other areas that were impacted by this, but we've brought in today groups of educators who have a variety of experiences of the impact and the legacy of Section 28. We are 17 years on from its repeal in 2003 in England and Wales, and we've still got a long way to go before we've changed some of the negative impacts of it. So, introducing in our panelists today, we've got Joel Kenyon, who is a teacher in Liverpool. We've also got Paul Welch, who is an active teacher as well, and a National Education Union executive member too. We've got Den Henry, who again is a teacher who is very active in the NEU as well, within the LGBT plus network. And Michael Dance, who is an NEU member as well, I believe, who was very active during the 80s and the 90s in a lot of the protests around the repeal of Section 28, or asking for the repeal of Section 28. And Kate Hutchinson, who is my dear colleague at Diversity Role Models and a fantastic activist and educator in terms of LGBT inclusion. So welcome everybody. If we start with question one, my first question around this really is that word impact. This was a little piece of legislation. It was a clause that went into the Local Authority Act in 1988, so an amendment to that act. But in terms of history, it's had a massive impact on the atmosphere in schools. So my first question is really, what was that impact for you as an educator, or for the people around you, the people you loved? If I can first come to Michael.
Hello. Yes, I was unlucky enough to be on my teacher training when Clause 28 was announced. And when I heard Thatcher talk as she did in that speech, it horrified me and it made me really angry. Just in that part of the 80s, in the mid 80s, there had been a lot of progression in terms of the fact that LGBT plus issues were starting to be talked about in schools. There was a book called Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. There were a number of London councils that took initiatives about trying to promote a positive image of LGBT plus people. And it was that Thatcher was fighting against. It was trying to erase really any kind of semblance of LGBT people in education, so that people could stay uneducated, with no influence on them other than a very, very negative discipline, discriminatory attitude. And I was at the Institute of Education at the time. We organised protests against Princess Anne, who'd said some awful things about people with HIV/AIDS at the time. She was the kind of patron of the Institute of Education at the time. We had a big protest outside. The two big things, though, were the demonstrations that happened in 1988. Brilliant demonstrations, resistance towards Section 28. But of course, that made it really difficult. I was being a trainee teacher. It was very difficult then to make, kind of try and develop any materials, any resources, and it put a kind of cautionary effect onto you, so that you were told, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that. You'd be better to play safe if you didn't mention LGBT plus things. And so that was always going to be the constraint that was going to come out of Section 28.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I think, the words, hearing someone who was, the leader of our country at that time saying such horrible words, homophobic words, at a time where you'd think, 1967 and the change of the law around being gay, you'd think by the 80s, by that point, that there'd be a lot more, acceptance. And then suddenly this piece of legislation kind of hits the community and hits the families around that. Kate, what were your experiences of this at the time?
Wow, I was just finishing school probably at that time. So I was, 88. I was probably about 17 or 18. I was in the sixth form, and I wasn't out at school. Back in the 80s, I mean, we still see a lot of use of homophobic language within schools casually today. Back then, I even heard staff members using it back then. They would use certain slurs, criticizing people if, like maybe in sports, if they, weren't trying hard enough, they'd call somebody a big puff or something like along those lines. So for me, all that type of thing kept me as far in the closet as was possible back then. But I first remember hearing around the press starting to whip up quite a whole furore and hysteria around the book, Jenny Lives with Eric and Martin. And then a lot of it was really press fueled that then the government, ran with that. And I remember thinking, because as Michael said, certain little bits during the 80s were starting to progress. So there were little signs that things were getting slightly better. But then when I saw that and I saw the reaction, and maybe other people I was in school with made comments that actually were positive towards Section 28 in some cases. I mean, you did get some negative voices, but if anyone was pushing against it within sort of my peer group in school, quite often they got bullied for doing that, or they got them picked on for that. So for me, I kept really quiet because I was self-conscious if I said anything, it might out me and I would get bullied for it. So I felt really uncomfortable and torn at that time.
Mm-hmm. So really creating an atmosphere that made bullying worse and kind of normalized that derogatory language that we, as you said, sadly we still see some of it being used today. Jen, what are your thoughts and comments around the impact of Section 28 when it was brought in?
I think growing up, I was in Jamaica at the time, but pretty much I think Section 28 was, for those people that was living in that time and going through, was a horrible decision, and there was no support, there was no safe space. So for me, I think Section 28 for people LGBT plus, even looking back at my country, Jamaica, which is still, it's illegal, LGBT plus people, it's illegal to be gay, to be a lesbian, to be, I only think it was a disadvantage. And clearly our focus, that's why my fight today, learning about Section 28, that's why we are here. And the campaign and the work that we're all doing is to make us create that safe space.
Yeah, absolutely. Like that huge kind of impact on creating a space where people are safe to be themselves. Or if we've got a piece of legislation, we'll talk a little bit later on at looking to the future and maybe making sure this doesn't happen again. But if we want to say that everyone's got the right to be themselves and be safe doing so, then we need to make sure that the environment is like that. And as we've heard from everyone so far, it definitely did create an unsafe space for LGBT people in school. Paul.
Yes, thanks, Nimeta. So I actually tried to forget about Section 28 until probably watching It's a Sin a few weeks ago. And while watching that, it suddenly kind of flashed back and helped remind me of when I grew up. Obviously, in the late 80s, I was in primary school, but in 92, I started secondary school. And I would say the atmosphere in secondary school was a homophobic atmosphere. The word gay was branded around in class and in school, synonymous with the lesser, really trying to, oh, this is gay, that's gay, you're gay, and really a very negative experience growing up, in a sense, in secondary school. The one subject that where this was kind of open and could be discussed was RE, religious education, in a state non-denominational state secondary, and I also teach, and I'm head of RE in a non-denominational state secondary. And I do recall now conversations that would never exist today, and they were conversations that I guess were acceptable because of Section 28, about where people could say freely their views, which were quite homophobic views, and where there was no level of challenge being brought within the classroom. And obviously, I'll come to my experiences later on about today, but that's very different. So I think school became a very hostile place, and I'm not sure why anyone would feel able to come out and be themselves in that environment due to Section 28.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So again, creating that really hostile, really negative environment that made it okay for people to be homophobic and not challenged. I think that challenge, as a former educator, former teacher myself, current educator, but I used to be in the classroom, and I really understand the power of that, consistently challenging things that undermine people's rights is an important part in creating that ethos in a school. If you haven't got educators feeling able to challenge, I can really see how that has created this perfect storm of hostility for a lot of our young people. Joel, you're slightly younger, so you would have went to school under Section 28 for some of it, and I remember you were saying that it learning about it has been quite poignant for you as an educator now.
Yes, so I started secondary school in 2004, so the year after it was repealed. So in 2004, you'd think, oh, it's been repealed and it would start to fix itself. But then during the when I was in school for secondary school, I was in one of the largest secondary schools in the country. There was about 1,800 pupils in the school at the time. And when I was in year 9, I was the only out gay person in the whole school of 1,800 people. I didn't necessarily have any support. I had no one I could go speak to. There was no group. There was no. We didn't have a counsellor in our school. There was no posters. No, absolutely nothing. I was bullied while I was in school. It was not a pleasant experience whilst I was there. Again, being the only gay person in the school was just a nice way to target someone. And I did get a lot of hateful comments. Some of the hateful comments that have been said already. I got them targeted towards me, but it wasn't until afterwards, until I was around about 19 years old, after I'd left school, that I started to realise why. And it was Section 28. So after I learned about it when I was 19 years old, learning about the fact that no one knew that if they could help me, it wasn't the done thing to come about saying, yes, it's okay, but don't worry, Joel, it's okay for you to be a gay man. It wasn't necessarily something anyone was allowed to say to me. So it was kind of one of them, an eye-opener for me as to why I was kind of left alone and why I didn't really have that help whilst I was in school. And that's kind of just from the legacy of Section 28. I finished school 5 years after it had been repealed. And for that entire time I was there, I had no help or no one to speak to. And that was all because of a law that was brought in and repealed long before I left school. You're still muted. Hi.
It wouldn't be lockdown if somebody wasn't still on mute while I was trying to talk with it. I was just saying that, you know, it's really interesting actually that just that kind of, you know, magically repealing it doesn't change the impact that's been caused, and that for young people that have gone through school after 2003, there's still an impact there, and as we've mentioned already that there's still issues going on in schools and teachers feeling able to, you know, to bring up LGBT identities freely. Before we talk about that legacy and that impact and kind of what needs to happen to kind of move forward from this, I think it's really important to reflect on the fact that it took over 10 years for this, over a decade, for this piece of legislation to be repealed. The legislation is clearly homophobic if you read the wording of it, and then will have an impact on the wider LGBT plus community as well, because of association of you know, having family structures that are different. And when we think about what it took to get this repealed, I think it's quite for me quite eye-opening as to how deep some of the bigotry in our political structures and our social structures have been over the years. We've got some footage of some of the protests that took place. I believe we've got a video coming up now of the storming of the BBC, so BBC studio during, I think, the recording of a news broadcast.
Lastly, a story that started in our studios tonight. The BBC has begun an inquiry into how 4 women demonstrators were able to get into the 6 o'clock television news studio and attempt to disrupt the start of tonight's programme. They were protesting against a new law, which comes into effect at midnight, stopping local councils from promoting homosexuality. Mike Smart reports.
It was clear to viewers from the start of the 6 o'clock news that something was wrong.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. In the House of Lords, a vote is taking place now on a challenge to the poll tax. Tory rebels have said that the tax...
Sue Lawley apologised and continued to broadcast. Out of vision, her co-presenter Nicholas Witchell and other BBC staff restrained the protesters. Outside the studio, one woman who'd handcuffed herself to camera cables was cut free.
Lovely. Thanks very much.
Another and the piece of studio furniture she'd handcuffed herself to were parted in a corridor. Led away, the women repeated their protest.
Protesting about rights for lesbian and gay people.
The inquiry into how the women got into the studio is already underway.
Well, what happened this evening was intolerable. There'll be a proper inquiry and we'll make sure that this doesn't happen again on any of our news programmes. I do say that I think Sue Lawley and Nick Witchell behaved admirably in the circumstances, and I'm very glad that we continued with the broadcast and made sure that all our news went out.
With handcuffs still attached to the camera cable and the 6 o'clock news still on the air, the protesters were taken away by police.
Wow, so yeah, that was a protest even before the legislation had been put in place. So protesters as early on as before it was brought in. That wouldn't have been, the only one. That was just the start of a number of years of protesting. Michael, I know that you were very active at the time. You already mentioned some of what you experienced. what was it like at the time to be protesting for rights of educators?
There was a huge anger because when Thatcher made that speech and when it became clear what Clause 28 meant, people were really wanted to show their anger and disgust at what had happened, and they wanted to stop it. And in the very week that Clause 28 was organised, there was a demonstration down Whitehall, which is the angriest demonstration I've ever been on for any issue. And people, LGBT plus people, had a sit-in in the street. They climbed the gates of Downing Street and rattled the gates. It was absolutely brilliant. That was followed by another demonstration a few weeks later. And it's then that you started to see people like Ian McKellen come out and make speeches on the demonstrations and make a stand against it. I became a member of Teachers Against Section 28, and we met weekly in order to try and plan events in order to try and oppose Section 28. It was absolutely appalling. It culminated that year in a big demonstration in Manchester, where there must have been over 20,000 people who showed their absolute disgust for what the government were doing. And I think it's really important to say that this was not uncontested. There was a huge anger against what happened, and it made people wake up and start to become really political about it and realize that LGBT plus issues were political issues. They weren't just personal issues. They were something that were to do with your civil rights, with your own identity, with the idea that you were being challenged for who you were. And it's a sin's already been mentioned, but in the government in the 80s were happy to see or complacent about people being killed off in the HIV/AIDS crisis. They were also trying to erase us out of existence in terms of education and culture. And that was the level of the threat, and people realized that and did fight back. So there were huge demonstrations. There were really angry demonstrations against what the government did.
Mm-hmm. I think as someone, so I'm quite similar to Joel and Paul in so much as I was at school. So I finished my A levels in 2004. So most of my school was under Section 28, and I didn't learn about it until one of my A level teachers, my sociology teacher, actually told us what it was. And I was about similar age to you, Joel, 18, 19, when I'd heard about what it was. And I think for me, the years that I was at school, there was such a silence around it that it's really eye-opening to hear how deep the anger and how big the protests at the time were. And I think that's a story that we've mentioned it's a sin, and how important that's been for the community to hear that story of the people who lost their lives in the HIV and AIDS crisis. I think this is an important story to tell as well. So I'm so glad that we're here today and talking about it. Kate, were you involved in any of the protests at the time, or people that you know?
Not as directly. I was going sort of into further education coming out of school, but I did see a lot of people active then within those circles. But what's just brought up there about that resistance, there was that constant pushback. Stonewall pretty much came out of the opposition as a charity. Stonewall pretty much came out of the opposition to Section 28. Also, I can remember, a colleague actually from another charity, Sue Sanders from Schools Out, she's the chair there. She's spoken to me before now about how she was teaching at the time. She was a drama teacher at the time, and she was of the attitude of, well, I'm going to support any young person who needs that support no matter what. If they try and kick me out of my job, I don't really care, and I'm going to stand up for it. So there was that sort of quite, positive pushback as well. But for myself, I wasn't involved directly, but I saw the influence of, and I saw that pushback. There was also, we had those, there were 3 lesbian activists who abseiled into the Lords during the middle of a debate on Section 28, and I think that was about February '88, something like that, just before it came in.
Wow, yeah, gosh, I'd love to see. Maybe it's a little project we could compile a timeline of different acts of protest and pushback over the years, because obviously you will have, you know, a variety of different things that were used to kind of push back on this. I think I recall, Kate, I think you might have shared this with us at work with diversity role models, but a radio interview that I think Ian McKellen was being interviewed with an MP, and it's on the BBC. It's freely available on the BBC to have a look. But this was something that was published very early on in the 80s, and it was interesting to see that the level of pushback and debate, even at the time, you know, on the BBC, you know, being published in the media there. Thinking about people that maybe, you know, like myself, were at school at the time and maybe not directly involved in protests. So coming to Paul and Joel. Paul, what does it feel? How does it feel to hear about the amount of protests that went on to try and push back against it?
I think it's fantastic that actually those protests existed. I obviously and honestly can't recall them being the age that I was. But I'd like to say this. I was a newly qualified teacher in 2003, and the atmosphere which I spoke about previously and said that actually, you know, in the early 90s in school, that, you know, there wasn't a positive atmosphere around homosexuality. There was nowhere to discuss it openly. That the word gay was branded as some kind of nasty disease or some kind of a, you know, really negative. And when I became a teacher in 2003, I was really sad to see that some of this still existed. You know, I still experienced in my classroom children that would, you know, refer to something as that's gay and that's gay, and that worried me massively. So that was 2003. So that was around the time that it was repealed, and I just felt that society had moved on so much, and I suppose on reflection now, I wish I'd been more aware, more politically aware then, because I think, you know, in the late 90s and early 2000s, we absolutely should have been taking a stand and doing more, and maybe had the protests kind of, had there been maybe a second wave or a second round of protests, perhaps we could have had that repealed earlier. But again, you know, it's something that you look back on with hindsight, and we would love to turn the clock back, ideally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so even though the extent of the anger was huge, the extent of the protest was huge. I think, yeah, I echo that at that time of when we did lead up to repeal. I think, you know, although I'm like you as well, I don't think I was particularly politically minded at that time as an older teenager, but I don't recall there being much that was in the public eye necessarily. I don't recall, you know, hearing about that as a young person, that maybe there are lessons to be learned about sustaining that protest, perhaps, if there are things we do need to push back on in the future around this. Joel, how does it feel to hear about the protests that took place?
So one thing I just wanted to specifically pick up on is what Kate said earlier. And Kate said that this was a thing that was fueled by the media, and I genuinely believe that it was, mostly because sentiments from people who I know who are older teachers have said that no, I'd support anyone. Even then, it was a thing I would, if any people I had was gay or any LGBT whatsoever, I'd try and provide them with a little bit of help at the time. It reminds me of two newspaper articles from the Daily Mail from 2000, when Section 28 was originally tried to be repealed in the UK, and it was defeated in the House of Lords, and the front page of the Sun was Blair is beating on gays, and the front page of the Daily Mail was praise be to the Lord. And it was just when you read them types of things and you realise that this wasn't necessarily a thing that people wanted. This was just a campaign that seemed to exist. from people like the Daily Mail and people like the Sun. And when I try to think of now, while as being a teacher and the effects of like just constantly being surrounded by that negativity, when I first started my PGCE, so I've been a teacher for this is my 4th year, I started my PGCE, and I remember a conversation I had with my personal tutor, and she said that she had a conversation with me where she said, "Are you sure are you going to come out when you're in school? Is that going to be a thing that you do?" And it was just kind of, I'd never thought about it. It wasn't necessarily a thing that I thought about, and I went, "Well, if someone asks, then yeah." And she said, "Well, there may be that can cause some difficulties, and this is only 4 years ago, and that can cause some difficulties. It might be a behavior management problem, and it just might be easier. So, like, but it's up to you. It's up to you." And I just kind of took it as, well, no, like that needs to be dealt with, and I'm perfectly happy and perfectly fine to be a proud and out gay teacher. It's got nothing to do about my behavior management. And if there's an issue with a pupil, that's I deal with it in the same way that I deal with any other hated comment. And it was just one of them. It's still a culture that there's still some people, it's still there. It still needs to be combated. There still needs to be a conversation about it. And I think things like this that we're doing, and people who speak out about it, and there's been articles in The Guardian and in the BBC about what was Section 28 and what was its impact. And this conversation that we're having now just seems to be such a positive conversation to have, just to realise the fact that this was a belief that was held by some people, and I can't wrap my head around where these people had this mentality at all.
That just as a short a time ago as 4 years ago, as a trainee teacher, you were advised not to be an out teacher. That's shocking, really. I mean, like knowing the data around it that I do, and I know there's still a lot of teachers that do struggle to teach in an environment where they feel able to be out. I can understand that, but at the same time, when you sit and think about the fact that there's nothing stopping you being your true self, and actually that is hugely discriminatory in an environment where we have legislation against discrimination of protected characteristics of which LGBT plus identities are. Yeah. It's really a huge impact.
I had a really weird conversation on the very first day in my school, very first day of teaching in my first school. One of the teachers went, have the kids spoke to you about any of it? And I went, well, yeah, I've been asked, and I've been honest. I've said yes, the very first day of teaching. And one of them went, "Oh, I'll tell you a story about a teacher who used to work here." And I went, "Okay." And the story was, well, at the time I thought it was quite amusing, but then thinking back on it, it was about a English teacher who was a gay man and was in a civil partnership with his husband, and he wasn't out to pupils and created this completely fake woman that he was married to and had been married to for years, and it was just rude that he kept on going. He made a lie when he first started, and just kept it going and going and going and going for years, and he'd end up creating this completely fake woman, and the kids believed that he wasn't actually a gay man. And I do feel really sorry for him. I really do, because I just wish there was someone else. There's someone that you can speak to. There are gay teachers. It's perfectly fine and perfectly normal, and it's just about having that little bit extra confidence and a bit of a oomph about you to be an out gay teacher.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to reiterate that, people should come out when they feel comfortable to do so, when it's the right time for them. If you don't want to be out in the workplace, then that's absolutely fine. But the impact for young people to have that representation is huge as well. If you've got any LGBT young people, just to know that there are LGBT teachers in their school that are clearly going to be safe people they can go to and talk to about issues they might have faced is massive. Den, we've talked a lot about the importance of protest around LGBT issues, but around wider issues as well. How important is the act of protest to you?
I just want to add to the fact that when I came to this country, and I in a city school, primary school in London, I went to my a teacher pretty much want to come out to staff and to parents and to the school community. And I was told by my head teacher in 2003, it's okay to be who you are, but try not to allow the parents to know about, and the staff to know about me being a lesbian. So that part, I wish at the time I had the support around me, the network, I could challenge that and to say why. So I went into the class. I stayed in the closet at that school, which I went there wanting to come out and to share, to be visible, so that other children and other staff could be open about who they truly are. And I think protesting now, the things that we're doing to make create these spaces is so important. And what we fight for equality and for people to be their true self is quite important for me. What we are doing, and with the Pride marches and bits that we're doing as in schools and with the RSC thing that I put in place, and what we should do as educators is not to give up. Not to just say, okay, when they put the policy and said, oh, it's okay for you to just be you are, but don't share it. We have to have that fight within us and that little push to say, no, we want to express ourselves. We want to be, because education, school is a place where everyone should be their true self. That's what we teach. That's what we're teaching the children. So I think the fight, we have a long way to go, but we are come a far way now. And with these support, an organization that is supporting LGBT plus people and students, we are getting there slowly but surely.
Thanks so much. Brilliant. Yeah, we're slowly but surely we are getting there. And I really echo what you say about how that actually is a fight, even just as an educator, to be out in the workplace or to want your school that you're working in to do more for LGBT inclusion is quite often. I know there's a variety of experiences out there. Some schools are doing more of that work than others, and I do come across in my work, in my NEU activism as well. I do come across a lot of educators who are quite early in that journey, and they particularly I've talked to some initial teacher trainees as well who were sort of taking it on with their schools and talking to SLT, and that's a huge thing. If I remember myself when I did my PGC, I don't think I ever would have had the courage to stand up to senior leadership and say we need to be doing more of this. So that's really fantastic to be hearing about the work that's going on. The fight is still being had. For those of you that recall at the time, I'd quite like to know how it felt when Section 28, Clause 28 was repealed. So really at that moment when it was taken out of legislation, what was that like for you? So I'll come to Michael first with this one. Oh, Michael's on mute.
Sorry. The first thought that comes into my mind is that it was a long time coming, because between 1988 and 2003, that's 15 years where nothing happened. And LGBT plus curriculum building and developing was put on hold and went backwards. So I think that there was a relief in the sense, yes, that's okay, that's gone. But also the effect also was very, very inbuilt into the system by then. During the 90s, I just want to come back on something that Joel said. I think one of the reasons why they brought it in as a legal thing wasn't just it wasn't just a press thing. It was about trying to enforce the values of the ruling class onto people, and that's the ideas of the family, heterosexism, heteronormativity. All those things were part of what Margaret Thatcher was talking about when she was saying the kids were being cheated. She wanted them to have this idea of normal, and as we know, normal is not a word that really is a good word to use when we talk about identity, when we talk about sexual orientation and so on. That gives a false idea about what people are. But it did matter that actually went from the legislative books, and it opened up a new era. And at first, I think there was a hangover. There was a hangover that was very serious because of the fear that had been created over those 15 years. And those 15 years meant that people were scared to do things, weren't sure how far to go, how to bring things up for the first time, or so on. Now then, during the 90s, I was out, all the way through the decade. And what I saw happening was that kids were really crying out for something to be done. They come and talk to you and say, can't we do something in registration about this? Can't we have a lesson in English where we can do something about this? And we did start to do that. We did have a book, 2 Weeks with the Queen, that we developed in English. We talked about the gay characters in things like A Taste of Honey. We talked about the issue. But also in 1999, when the Admiral Duncan was blown up, by David Copeland, I think his name was, the fascist. We had a lesson on that in English as well. And we were starting to move to do things in a way that hadn't been possible for a while. So 2003, the repeal of Section 28, good, but things had already started to change. And things were already starting to get better, but there was still this massive amount of work to do. The other issue I think is important to notice is that during the 90s, most unions became LGBT plus friendly. All unions started to have LGBT plus policies, LGBT plus committees, and that made a huge difference. And that is what made the Labour Party move on as well and accept LGBT plus rights, and eventually led to the development of Section 28. So I would say it's what people did on the ground, as in their unions, in their schools, that led to that idea that was okay to happen. But it did still take the second term of the Labour Party. It didn't happen until then. But it did then open up a chance to change things and move on. And as I said, though, there was that hangover.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, I know from my experiences with trade unionism, how much being part of a union has made me feel more welcomed with my identity. So I know in my early part of my teaching career, I was not out. I'm a bi woman, and I kept that a secret. I hid any relationships that I had with people of the same gender. And so I only became kind of stronger in my ability to be myself when I became more active in the National Education Union. So yeah, I definitely echo what you're saying there. Kate, do you remember the repeal, and how did you feel at the time?
Yeah, I do. It's funny because I was in employment at that point. I remember because in the 90s, I came out in the 90s, then went back into the closet again because of a certain because of employment situation that I was in, unfortunately, and because I still heard so many negative attitudes towards anyone who's LGBT at the time. Seeing that in 2003, and also as a trans person, seeing right around that time the Gender Recognition Act was coming together, which then came together, Gender Recognition Act 2004. That gave me a huge amount of hope. But as Michael said there, the hangover, and that's a great way, I think that's a perfect term to describe it. There was that hangover, and that hangover is still around now. Namerta, from school staff we work with, if it's a new school I've never worked with before, and there can be so much, such a huge amount of insecurity about actually delivering any sort of education still within school. I know we've got all the new RSC guidance coming in and those requirements, but there is still so much fear about it, fear of parental quite often fear of parental reactions, when quite a lot of time they're forgetting about the reactions of parents who are from LGBT families, because you always forget about those families. You see the angry protests maybe on the news. I'm jumping ahead of myself now, but it gave me a little bit of hope at the time. But I was still well aware that we had a long way to go, and many schools and many organisations were still far from inclusive.
Absolutely, yeah. I think you're completely right that word hangover, it's a hangover that's really taken a while to shift, and as we've said already, there's still a lot more work to do, but things are kind of slowly improving with the more this work carries on. I think moving on from kind of, you know, the repeal happened, we're 17 years on, we know there's a lot of work to be done. Kate mentioned RSE. So that's the new relationship and sex education statutory guidance that schools have to include material on LGBT plus identities, on issues around LGBT plus identities, and particularly in the case of primary, they're really heavily encouraged to talk about diverse families and make sure that they are meeting the needs of all of their young people that they teach. And more of those young people are in families that are same-sex headed, that are in families where you know, a parent might be LGBT plus. And so it's definitely, you know, getting to you know, this milestone at the end of this year. It was supposed to have been brought in September 2020, but has been delayed to the end of this academic year. But I think the kind of the reasoning being the pandemic and schools not necessarily having the time to put the materials in place to cover this. But coming to Paul, around RSE education, has that been something that you've been working on in school? Have you been planning and preparing for teaching RSE in your classes?
Yeah, obviously, as part of a broad and balanced curriculum, and as part of a pastoral program, RSE is really vital. I would also say, coming back to my own subject, RE, I think kind of early on we saw some kind of change in GCSE specifications, and we saw a unit which is referred to as kind of marriage and the family introduced, and this for me opened up the possibility to discuss families and to discuss different types of families, and to actually have lessons where we look at homosexuality, we look at the the statistics, but we also look at the lived experience and the importance of pride, and create that atmosphere. And I think over the years, the attitudes have really started to move forward and to change, and I think some of that's been done through education. As you know, the introduction of civil partnerships, I think 2005, also then changed that dynamic as well, and that's quite an odd one, because in 2003, you're talking about the repeal of Section 28, yet in 2005, I think we're talking about the introduction of civil partnerships. So there's a very short gap there, and it seems as if things moved on really quickly. And I think RSE definitely strengthens that now, and I think we have a real kind of cross-curricular effort, definitely in secondary school, where we're able to have much more open dialogue, and we've really succeeded in creating an atmosphere now where children and pupils feel safe and feel able to be who they are. And I'm not disputing the fact that some people may still feel discomfort and find it a very difficult process. But I think, because of the curriculum changes and developments, and some of that could be attributed also to the breakdown of the state education system. And I don't want to get onto a political soapbox, but obviously the introduction of the academies took a lot of schools out of local authority control as well in 2000. and being an academy gave you certain curriculum freedoms over not being an academy, but just being a state-maintained school. So I think there's a variety, multifaceted factors that we can think about and consider that have actually brought and developed a real change in educational settings. And I'm really proud to have seen that in my lifetime and experienced that. Schools are no longer places where children can label things as gay, where they can, even use the word gay as something to do with the lesser or something bad. We've really managed to move things forward, although it seems like it's just taken too long.
Yeah, I think that your point about academisation is really important, because whilst RSE is going to be in place at the end of this year, it also needs to be monitored as well. And I know Kate and I, when we go in and do our staff training, we will say that this is going to be monitored by Ofsted. It does have to be. And I think when we think about the fact that schools, a lot of them, especially in the northeast, there are a lot of schools that aren't under local authority sort of maintained statuses anymore. Knowing what's actually happening in those academies and how they're approaching this is something that's kind of not quite so clear anymore. And so you're right that is it might be considered a bit of a political statement, but whether academies stay or not, I think it is important that there's some accountability and that they are, this is an opportunity to make a real difference. Joel, have you been preparing for relationship and sex education in your area of teaching?
So yes, so this has been a focus of mine. So I worked with my head teacher last year, trying to think what can we do, how do we need to implement it, and we've gone through. We had a little task force set up with one person from each department, tried to find a way to introduce some form of LGBT representation in their subject. Obviously, I'm science, so we had I teach sexual education in year 7, 8, and 9, and then again in year 11. So then it was trying to bring in just a little bit of relationship in my subject and in other subjects across the school, and then specifically in PHSE lessons, it's having a bespoke curriculum that we've tried to make for our pupils and what we think that would best support our pupils as well, and then just signposting. So for the relationship in sexual education, we've got little groups that we can talk to. We pay a company to run an online chat that the kids can speak to, and that's on every single computer as soon as they log in. It's a little thing that they can speak to if they've ever got any issues at all. And then specifically across the school with PHSE, I've been trying to make lessons specifically on LGBT relationships and just what Margaret Thatcher would call the non-normal family units. And it has been difficult because there isn't many resources out there, so you do kind of feel that you're just using your experience. So it's one of them, it's like conversations like these, and especially the conversations that I've had with members of the NEU, for example, is just trying to bring in as many of them resources and many of them different lived experiences as we can to try to make our RSE lessons more inclusive. And that's one thing that I do think schools will struggle with, that if they don't have members of the LGBT community inside their schools, it may be a little bit more difficult for them to implement it as best as it possibly can be.
On mute again. I completely agree. I think that's one of the biggest challenges is, as Michael said, there's been this 15-year vacuum where no one's really been allowed to focus on this, and so there aren't any resources. I mean, I know that there are some resources that have come out. I know that NEU use I think it's called the Agenda resource, which has a variety of different activities you can use. but that it's something that is slowly building, and teachers have to put in the time, in their planning time, and we know that it's a difficult job at the best of times in terms of getting ready for your usual curriculum lessons. So to be having time to build this in as well. But that I completely agree with what you've said as well about making sure that it's part of the curriculum in terms of secondary, all the different subjects. It becomes that natural kind of embedded throughout the year, and not just in History Month. It becomes just part of a normal conversation, just normalising it as part of everyday teaching. Jen, how have you been preparing for RSC?
Right. So at my school, pretty much, we're approaching RSCs on we're doing a phase approach where we started looking at implementation of the LGBT plus implementation across the curriculum at like an action plan approach. So I know with the pandemic we are slightly behind, so we should have done this September 2019. This the phase approach, the year one should have been. So we are slightly behind, where we write a proposal to the governors, which we have done, and school board, and how to become LGBT plus friendly school. And then the step 2, review equality policy, which we have done. So far in step 3, we are still training teachers in the use of age-appropriate literature and other resources, artifacts and books and toys, etc., involving LGBT plus resources. So we're still clearing that, still building on that, in fact, and training process. Stage 4, train the parents, run a series of workshops where we started that, but still need to be embedded more for parents to build awareness and keep them informed and answer questions, concern, and views. Step 5 is to launch the program through assemblies. We have done that already, and still building, where we talk about LGBT plus History Month at my school. We have done an assembly on that. And so we need to build more into having consultation, like from Educate and Celebrate and Stonewall, different providers that can give more support to my school. And step 6, make sure the training given to teachers action have been helping SLT to develop training and where they can find resources to implement throughout the curriculum. And it's a reviewing and evaluating the pack of it as we go along. We are reviewing, always focusing on what is going well and what can be improved even better. It's difficult with the online, but we still remote learning at the moment. We're trying to make sure it's embedded, not only for LGBT plus History Month, but throughout the year. And getting the resources, just because of the pandemic, is a bit slow. But we should have been in here too, in the phase approach, where we are monitoring and embedded in the curriculum LGBT plus. But we are getting there. It's just that because of the pandemic, some teachers are not, they believe that doing that weekly lesson on RSC from remote learning perspective is quite challenging. But myself is doing, we share stories. I do all the pipe resources, uses books to share stories with because I'm from a primary perspective. So that's what we are doing. So it's always looking and improving as we go along. I said we had assembly for LGBT plus History Month, where we look at what is LGBT plus and look at important LGBT plus people within different areas of the curriculum. So it's having that balance is the language we use. In maths, we could just, rather than saying two mummies, different things, to just, it's the language we use. Try to be more inclusive is how we use the language. So that's pretty much the start. Is a start. We could have gone further ahead, but because of the pandemic, some teachers still need more support, and some teachers are going ahead and at it, but some are still need more training, which we, because of the pandemic, is a bit restricted at this time. But we started and just need to be embedded more.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's what you've just pointed out about teachers needing more time and more support as well is critical right now. You mentioned Educate and Celebrate that have resources that can be used. Stonewall as well have brought out teaching packs. Kate, I'll come to you to talk about what we've done at Diversity Role Models and what's on offer for teachers that might, or educators that might be listening who'd like to utilise our support.
Yeah, big plug here. So yeah, that's so true. I mean, if anything, we've noticed during the pandemic, it's an upswing in requests for staff training as well, and we're able to give that. I mean, I think the last 12 months or so, we've spent a lot of time and energy into making sure that we can convert all of the support we gave before the pandemic into a digital form, which funnily enough, we found in some ways we can now reach people and support schools and students that we couldn't before because of geography. So we have got a whole online new online resource of our role model story. So DRM, if you're not completely aware of what we do, we're an education charity, LGBT plus education charity. We have just produced, and we have role models. So names, it's the clue is in the name. Our role models normally are volunteers from the LGBT community who come into schools with us when we're delivering our workshops, who talk a little about their lives and their stories. And for students and staff, we find our volunteers' stories, they build up a lot of empathy and a lot of understanding of LGBT lives that they never had before, because generally, going back to the media, we've seen a lot of media stereotypes, negative media stereotypes of the LGBT community. So our role models do that. We've got a brand new resource where we've got a bunch of our role models telling their stories, telling their experience, and they're a wide and diverse group of people. And our education team, so we've put our heads together and we came up with a load of fantastic activity sheets, key questions, things that can be used within schools, can be used by parents with their children. To support that, you can check us out at diversityrolemodels.org. We can also support schools as in staff training and student training. So that's my quick long plug for DRM.
Definitely do check DRM out as well as Stonewall and Educate and Celebrate. And if anybody, does anybody else on the call today have any other suggestions of organisations that teachers can get resources from?
There's so many. There are great ones out there. I mean, I think you've mentioned most.
Yeah, if anyone, I'm sorry, Jill, go ahead.
I remember a organisation called Just Like Us. I follow them on Twitter and I've got well too into them. They had a campaign of be the teacher that you wanted, or be the teacher that you needed. It's just a brilliant campaign. They have a few statistics on there from research that they've done or research they've collated. But their Twitter is really, really good, and their website has got some extra resources as well. So that's justlikeus.org.
I would also quickly add in gendered intelligence, another really good one.
Yeah, absolutely. So some brilliant resources there, and I think maybe we can include links to that in the comments when this video does go out on social media, on Facebook and YouTube, for you to, if you are an educator out there and you just want to click through and see. There's one in the top of my mind. So I was a biology teacher for a long time, and I have come across a resource called 500queerscientists.com. And that's just a resource with literally 500 working scientists across the world who have written a small short story about themselves, and it's a brilliant resource to kind of just naturally embed a bit of representation into science, which sometimes can be challenging in terms of all the factual stuff that you've got to teach, and if that's just brought in in a regular way across the year, it can really support representation there. So we've talked about the hope for the future in terms of RSC, and that there is a lot of hope. There's a lot of work to be done, but as educators, we are working on it, and hopefully we'll see more consistent good practice across all schools in the UK in terms of inclusion. But it's important to, when we think about history, to learn the lessons from history and to just reflect on the fact that, we talk about pride being a protest, and I think there are sometimes criticisms that come out to say that the pride work isn't necessarily as much of a protest as it should be, and that can be true in many cases, that the rights that we've won are fragile. And these are rights that we have to continue to fight to hold on to. And unfortunately, even though Section 28 has been repealed and we've got RSC being brought in, there have been a couple of incidences of DFE guidance, so guidance coming in from government, that maybe not directly is telling teachers that they can't talk about certain identities, but is definitely creating a very similar atmosphere of lack of confidence around talking about certain issues in our schools. So one of them is around talking about racism, but in particular guidance on external organisations that can be brought into school. Jen, I know that you're very active in the Black Educators Network, and particularly the Black LGBT plus network in the NEU. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the concerns were around DFE guidance on RSC in terms educators being able to talk about anti-racism activity?
Okay, thanks. Pretty much, there is a lot of Black-led organization that was formed during the pandemic. One of those is CARE, Collision of Anti-Racist Educators. And what is a network of school, college, and university teachers and staff, support staff, youth, community, union organizers, and other educators as well, came together along with the Black Educators Alliance, a set of NEU teachers as well, form self-organized network of Black educators who are committed to transforming structures and institutions which impact upon the, achievement, opportunities, and outcomes of Black educators, parents, family, and students. So it's about building the Black community. And what happened in October, those two, CARE and BA, look at the RSC guidance and the new what was set by the DFE, and we realized it wasn't what there was hidden agenda there, and it was restricting certain materials going into schools, certain providers, and we thought we had to challenge it. We were the first small organization just came up that this wasn't, this is just going back into Section 28, looking back, taking the rights away from the freedom of speech in terms of allowing children to have their political view debate. So it was restricting the freedom of speech. So we decided to take up the government and that to look at the to change, and we got them to now reviewing it. So that was the outcome of that. No one was looking at what was going on, the fine prints that we're trying to say. So the resources, like people like educators that believe in fighting for the minority groups, like trans rights, Black Lives Matter, the people that provide these training into school, where they were going to be restricted under new guidelines. So we found out and decided to challenge the government, which allowed them to withdraw that proposal that they had in place, the policy that we're going to put in place in schools. So it's been reviewed. I don't know if we won completely. Now the NEU also is challenging the government, helping to do that as well, support us in that fight. So we'll see. But I think it's important that we we look carefully, because of what was going on. A lot of people probably wasn't looking. The fact that RSC is now in school, they weren't looking at the fine prints and what was going on. But we came together, 20 educators, and we challenged them. We had a crowd fund with a legal challenge to put up the legal challenge, and as a result, it's now being reviewed. So I say we need active coming together. We need people to be active because there's going to be always people coming up with these little fine prints and not to stop us from having equality for all. And I think it's important that we have those dialogue in school, allowing the children to have different people coming in to give them different sides to everything. And that's why that's why we put the challenge in and got the result that we got. So yeah, the RS is about the things that they were saying, that some materials were, if it's extreme, what is extremist positions, and we thought it's not democratic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so
yeah, I remember reading that. I remember reading the DfE guidance just before Christmas to really get my mind around what was happening here. And I think what really struck me was that you're right, Den, in saying that the language was saying that teachers or schools shouldn't bring in people that have extremist views, which sounds like something I think most of the public would say, well, yeah, we shouldn't be exposing our young people to extreme views. But then the fine print within that was really highlighting that there was enough ambiguity to make schools feel like, well, maybe perhaps organisations like Black Lives Matters, for example, was something that could fall into that in terms of the way that it was written. And I think when we think about Section 28, for me, it really felt like this horrible situation of history repeating itself, where a small wording could be something that creates a huge impact for what teachers feel comfortable talking about. And then, as we saw over the 15-year period, it can create this culture of real hostility and negativity to people with differing identities, be it an LGBT identity, be it an identity around race, around religion, and really breaking down that dialogue that we need to have around equality. So race wasn't the only element of that DfE guidance, and that DfE guidance, although it's under review, it still stands as it was, I believe, at the start of this academic year. Kate, there's also material in there that is not supportive to teachers talking about trans issues in a way that's totally inclusive. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, it's funny actually, because that particular document, there's one thing actually to remember, as far as I can know with my facts on this, that was a set of notes, wasn't it, released more recently, and it's not actually part of the statutory, it's not an actual statutory document itself, but it's been taken as that by a lot of people who are using it as maybe a stick to beat certain groups with, like the trans community, there was even notes in there about anything that was anti-capitalist at one point, which I found shocking. It does feel like it's promoting some sort of agenda, and some of it feels like it's contradicting as well what's in some of the RSE guidance. So yeah, there were issues around how we educate on trans identities. Now, something I'm really well aware of, something I've noticed in the last couple of years as well, this has been ongoing since the government talked about reforming the Gender Recognition Act. There's been a huge upswing in a lot of anti-trans sentiment, and we've seen that a lot when it comes to education. Unfortunately as well, in the last couple of years, there are certain groups, certain web pages that have got a very strong anti-trans stance and are trying to use these type of documents to just strengthen their point against trans rights right now. I'm hearing, and we're talking about learning lessons from history right now, recently, even myself, to be honest, within the role I do in my job, I still experience pushback via social media against education on supporting young trans people within schools. I hear the same type of language, funnily enough, exactly the same type of language that was used in 1987, 88, when people were campaigning for Section 28. And as horrific as it sounds, and no word of a lie, I see these certain anti-trans groups. You know what? I'll call them transphobes, because that's what they are. I'll call these transphobic groups using that same sort of language, using the same sort of attitude as in Section 28 to try and deny our rights. I've seen these groups calling for a repeal of the Gender Recognition Act, and also calling for a newer version, a similar thing to Section 28 that would outlaw education on trans issues within schools. That I find horrifying. That's why we must always be aware of our history and never stand still for one moment. We can never stop on being aware of how we need to continue educating. We can win our rights. We can make positive leaps forward, but we always got to be aware that there's somebody out there who will try to take them back. And we can never let that happen. Not until we've got schools where every student, should be free to be themselves and be happy and be themselves. And unless we're supporting every student with different aspects of their identities, their sexualities, their whole being, we're wide, diverse people. Unless we're supporting all those young people in every way we possibly can, then we're not giving all those young people in our schools the equal opportunity to learn and advance. Sorry, I've rambled on a bit, but it's something I feel really quite strong about.
Not at all, Kate. Yeah, no, I think it's a huge part of this conversation that needs to be had, and that young trans students at school right now are in a situation of vulnerability if their schools don't feel able to support them, because if they've taken this, as you've said, guidance, it's not part of statutory requirement. If they've taken this guidance as if it was, that suddenly is, it's a repeat of Section 28. It's a repeat of creating that atmosphere where teachers don't feel like they can talk about issues that will be supporting our young people. And I think it's important that all of us as educators take on board the aspects of allyship as well. That one of the biggest issues I think with pushing back on discriminatory legislation like Section 28, like these bits of guidance, not legislation but guidance in RSE, that if you are in a minority group that's targeted by that, your voice is quieter. Whatever people might say about the group that you're part of, you have a quiet voice, and so we need to have a wider kind of support from allies around us, and that's definitely something that, as Northern Pride, we want to be supporting the trans community with any aspect of this sad resurgence in transphobia, to push back on that, and it's an important part of the protest element and the activism element that makes Pride what it is. Just to kind of wrap up and end, I wanted to give Paul an opportunity to talk about something really important that the NEU, we've got a lot of NEU representation here today, and the NEU have launched a campaign really in the last month or so. It's been a very recent campaign to support, we're talking about vulnerable young people, but supporting young people who are living in poverty, which puts them in a hugely vulnerable space, whether it's in terms of their health and well-being, but also their education as well, particularly with homeschooling. Paul, can you tell us a little bit about this campaign and how viewers can support?
I can, absolutely, Namerta. Thank you. Before I do that, I've got to say that Kate just totally summed up, I think, this what we still need to do in school, because as I said earlier, we have this fantastic atmosphere where people feel confident now, where pupils can talk about sexuality, but gender identity and for trans students and colleagues as well, it's something that we absolutely must do more on, and that's for me what is really important about the future. I want to also give a little plug for Show Racism the Red Card, because I had them come into my school and I had them run a workshop on the Equality Act, and it came from staff voice. Staff weren't aware of the language that they should be using. They felt as if they had little knowledge of the Equality Act, and I think that sort of staff training, especially when it can be provided by organisations like Show Racism the Red Card, will just help schools, step forward in many respects. And as I said, one of the things, as you said, no matter one of the things that the NEU is doing is that we launched a campaign in connection with the Daily Mirror. We committed £1 million of our members' money, and that's money that would have been spent on conferences, meetings, events, which we had obviously as a surplus due to the pandemic. And that money is being split into the different regions, and in every region there's 1,000 schools that will benefit, and they'll benefit in the form of a voucher. It's some of them for small primaries £500, bigger primaries 1,000, secondaries £1,500, and that voucher can be spent with our partner Viking, and that allows them to buy materials for students who are struggling at home to learn, who are living in poverty and don't have access to very basic materials here. And that is something which I'm really proud of, because we're living in 21st century Britain. Child poverty is wrong. It should not be happening. It should be something which we should call out on every level. And this campaign is part of that campaign, calling that out. I'm not supposing for 1 second we will manage to resolve child poverty by the £1 million. We are accepting donations. If people go to helpachildtolearn.com, they can find out more about the campaign and how to make a donation, because obviously the more money that we are able to fundraise, the more children we can help, and this is going as extra money into schools. On top of that, lots of our districts within the NEU are organising local activities or organising packs from money that they hold locally. I know in Durham, we're also putting together a Cooking with the NEU event, sending out the food and doing live kind of cookery class to help families, and just to get through these very difficult times. But we really, really have to stand up and stand united, together as colleagues, and tackle and challenge child poverty and call the government out on that.
Thanks so much, Paul, for talking to us about that. And I'm sure we can pop a link onto the Help a Child to Learn campaign if anybody does want to donate or support in any other way. So just to wrap up now, we've had an in-depth conversation. It certainly isn't the whole conversation, so it'd be interesting to see, comments that the audience can contribute around this whole, the history of Section 28 really is an important story that needs to be told. And as we've heard, there are lessons that need to be learned, and more pushback and more fight needs to be had. As Kate said, we can't be complacent. That we really do need to make sure that we're keeping hold of the rights that have been won so far. So anybody else from the panel have any final closing thoughts around this? Michael?
Yeah, I just think one very important lesson about Section 28 for today is this, that when we fight together and when we link our struggles together, we have more chance of winning. And so, when people talk about trans rights now, I think it's transgender people who are under attack, and we need to stand with them 100%. I also think we need to link there's been a fantastic anti-racist curriculum developed in the NEU. We should develop an LGBT plus curriculum to go alongside it and link the issues of anti-racism and anti-LGBT plus phobia. And I also think there's one last thing. Thatcher only got away with Section 28 because she had defeated the unions in the 1980s. And I think it's very important that we put LGBT plus work at the heart of every union, and also make sure that that is there for good and that is part of the struggles to make a better education system alongside every other issue, and that is totally just inbuilt into what happens. Thank you.
Fantastic. Joel, have you got any closing points you'd like to make?
And the only thing I wanted to add really is I've had many conversations with pupils who I teach about Section 28, about homosexuality being illegal in the UK, about people like Alan Turing and LGBT around the world. Kids are quite receptive to it, and even just the conversation alone is just a bit of an eye-opener, because a lot of the time the pupils will say, I don't understand how that's true. I don't understand how that happened. I don't understand how there's countries in the world where you can be killed or beheaded just because you're gay. And it's just that moment then, it's just when you have that conversation with some pupils, they do realise that this isn't just something that's come about by accident. I can't marry the person I love just because of an accident. It's through a fight from people who've come before me. I always say we stand on the shoulders of giants. Those people who've got us to where we are now, and it's still going to be a fight, and it's still always going to be a struggle. And especially when we're speaking with trans issues now, this is another fight that we've got. This is another thing that we need to talk about, and just having that conversation with pupils will help them realize that this is a thing that they may want to get involved in the future, be they allies, be they a member of the community themselves. But just that one conversation that you can have with them about the history that our community's been through can enlighten them and embolden them just to join in and help.
Super, absolutely. And anybody else before we finish off today? No, I just want to give a huge thank you to everybody for joining. I think this is, like we've already said, this is an important story that needs to be told. This isn't the end of it. We want to have more conversations like this, particularly in terms of education. I know Northern Pride want to do more for educators in the North East, which is the region we work with. And I know we've got people from across the country, and that's really bringing the wealth of expertise that we've got in the UK. So yeah, thank you very much. Hope everybody has a lovely rest of the day. And yeah, speak to you again soon in the future.